In the first part, we saw how Wu Zetian clawed her way from a palace concubine to China's only female emperor, leaving behind a trail of blood and fear. But that was just the rise. Now it's time to see what happened when age, paranoia, and betrayal caught up with her. This is the story of Wu Zetian's final days and the untold horrors that came with them. The Twilight of the Dragon Queen. For decades, Wu Zetian ruled the empire with unmatched authority. She had risen higher than any woman in China's history, sitting on the dragon throne itself, a seat reserved only for men. Ministers bowed to her command, generals marched at her word, and even the heavens were invoked to legitimize her reign. She built temples of staggering scale, rewrote the chronicles of history, and reshaped the empire in her image. To her supporters, she was a visionary. To her enemies, she was a tyrant whose name dripped with blood. But greatness carries a price. As Wu aged into her 70s, the mask of invincibility began to crack. The woman who once silenced entire courts with a glance now faced the one enemy she could not outwit: time. Her body weakened. Her grip, though still iron, began to tremble. And with weakness came pressure from all sides. Inside the palace, ambitious courtiers whispered of succession, eager to reclaim power for the Tang family she had displaced. Ministers who had long feared her cruelty began plotting in secret. Beyond the palace walls, enemies pressed at China's borders, sensing the Empress's vulnerability. Even her own family, once bound by loyalty, began to shift uneasily, their eyes drifting toward the throne she had fought so ruthlessly to keep. The once unshakable empire she had forged now trembled with unease. The Dragon Queen, who had risen through betrayal and murder, was now surrounded by betrayal herself. So the question remains, what happens when the woman who ruled with terror, spies, and blood begins to lose her grip? How does a reign built on fear collapse when fear itself no longer protects the throne? This is the twilight of Wu Zetian, a chapter not of triumph, but of paranoia, betrayal, and horrors that even her long reign could not escape. The Serpent's Coil, Intrigue, and Betrayal. For most of her reign, Wu Zetian thrived on intrigue. She had mastered the art of weaving alliances, pitting rivals against each other, and keeping her court under a veil of fear. But as age dulled her strength, the coils of intrigue began to tighten around her, this time not of her making, but against her. Her most trusted circle, the advisors, ministers, and even family members she had elevated, started to fracture. Loyalty, once bought with power and gold, began to waver. Ministers whispered behind closed doors that the empire could no longer be ruled by an aging woman. Generals, once her fiercest defenders, looked to her sons as possible successors. Even members of her own clan, the Wu family, who had risen with her, began to see opportunities in her decline. One by one, betrayals surfaced. A trusted chancellor was caught secretly drafting letters with her rivals. Eunuchs, who had once been her eyes and ears, began selling secrets to enemy factions. Court ladies she had promoted for their devotion shifted allegiance when her influence seemed to falter. The web of loyalty she had spun so tightly was unraveling thread by thread, and betrayal cut deeper when it came from her own blood. Wu Zetian had already sacrificed sons who dared oppose her. But now, even those who remained loyal in appearance plotted in shadows. Princes aligned with ministers in secret, waiting for the chance to reclaim the throne for the Tang Dynasty. Every look, every gesture from her children became a question. Were they obeying her out of loyalty or out of fear? And for how much longer? For a woman who had lived her life In absolute control, these cracks were unbearable. Wu's paranoia deepened. She saw betrayal in every corner, treachery in every whisper. Ministers were dismissed overnight, sometimes executed on little more than suspicion. The palace grew quieter, darker, a place where smiling faces masked hidden daggers. The Serpent's coil was now around Wu herself. The very strategies of manipulation and fear she had once used to dominate her rivals were being turned against her. And for the first time, Wu Zetian, the master of control, felt the sting of losing it. Whispers from the walls, her haunting reality. As Wu Zetian tightened her grip on power, her body was slipping from her control. By her 70s, the once commanding Empress began to show unmistakable signs of decline. Chronic pain, failing eyesight, and recurring fevers left her bedridden for long stretches. Some records even described large ulcers on her body, so severe they made it painful for her to sit or walk. Ministers who saw her were shocked. The woman who had once radiated authority now appeared frail, aged, and scarred by disease. But the weakening of her body only sharpened her paranoia. Where once she had relied on cunning and calculation, she now turned to desperation. The palace became a fortress of silence. Walls that had once echoed with debates and poetry now carried only whispers of fear. Her paranoia pushed her to ever more brutal measures. Servants were executed for minor mistakes, ministers dismissed for imagined slights. Trusted aides who had stood beside her for decades suddenly vanished into prisons, accused of crimes no one could prove. Officials walked through the palace in dread, never knowing if today's audience with the Empress would end with a reward or an execution. The atmosphere was suffocating. Historical accounts describe courtiers wearing perfumed cloths over their noses, not just to mask the smell of illness, but to cover the stench of fear and death that clung to the palace corridors. Conversations became coded. People bowed lower, spoke less, and smiled more, not out of loyalty, but out of survival. For Wu, this isolation was the cruelest irony. She had spent her life weaving a world of power, surrounding herself with loyalists and spies. But now, as her health deteriorated, those very walls seemed to close in on her. She could no longer distinguish between friend and foe, loyalty and treachery. The Empress, who had once controlled the empire, was now controlled by her own fear. The palace that had once been the heart of her power had become her prison. Behind its golden walls, Wu Zetian's haunting reality unfolded. A ruler trapped in silence, surrounded by ghosts of her own making. The phantom pains, unseen afflictions. As Wu Zetian's final years unfolded, her body became a battlefield she could no longer conquer. Chronic illness left her in near-constant agony. Ancient chronicles speak of painful ulcers and sores that covered her body, so severe that she could not sit upright for long. Some historians believe these may have been symptoms of advanced diabetes or untreated infections, conditions made worse by age and the stresses of rule. Others suggest she suffered from arteriosclerosis or strokes, which would explain her fading eyesight, dizziness, and sudden bursts of confusion. But the suffering was not only physical. Witnesses described the Empress as increasingly tormented by paranoia and hallucinations. She demanded that every visitor be carefully searched, that meals be tasted before she touched them. At night, she reportedly suffered sleeplessness and vivid nightmares, sometimes waking in terror, convinced assassins lurked in her chambers. To her court, these torments felt like karmic retribution. For decades, Wu had built her throne on betrayal, executions, and the blood of her own family. Now, as her body decayed, Many whispered that heaven itself was punishing her. Ministers pointed to the sores that disfigured her as evidence of divine judgment. To the Confucian elite, who had long despised her reign, her suffering was proof that no ruler, no matter how powerful, could escape the weight of their sins. And then there were the omens. Ancient Chinese records often tied supernatural signs to the fate of emperors, and Wu's decline was no exception. Strange eclipses and earthquakes were reported during her final years. Some claimed to see blood-red comets blazing across the sky, interpreted as symbols of cosmic anger. Within the palace, servants whispered of phantom footsteps in the night and shadows moving where no one stood. Even loyalists began to believe the Empress was haunted, not by ghosts from outside, but by the countless spirits of those she had destroyed. Whether these were natural events, medical realities, or exaggerated tales, the effect was the same. Wu Zetian was no longer seen as untouchable. To many, she was a woman cursed, rotting from within, stalked by death and abandoned by heaven. Her body betrayed her, her mind tormented her, and the heavens seemed to mock her. The Empress, who once wielded fear as her weapon, was now consumed by it. The Empress's last breath, a chilling legacy. By the year 705 AD, Wu Zetian was 81 years old, a staggering age for the time. But age brought her no peace. Her body was frail, her sores painful, and her once sharp voice now reduced to whispers. Even in this weakened state, she refused to relinquish power. She surrounded herself with young lovers and flatterers, men who told her what she wanted to hear, even as the empire slipped from her hands. The court had grown restless. Ministers, generals, and even her own family saw an opportunity. After decades of fear, they gathered in secret and plotted a daring coup. In the cold corridors of the palace, whispers turned into action. Armed officials stormed her chambers, removed her attendants, and forced her to step down. For the first time in nearly half a century, Wu Zetian was powerless. They did not kill her. Instead, she was moved to a quiet palace chamber, stripped of her authority, watched day and night by guards. The dragon throne was restored to her son, Emperor Zhongzong, the same son she had once deposed. The cycle of power had come full circle, but Wu was no longer its center. Only months later, in the silence of confinement, Wu Zetian died quietly in her bed. No courtiers surrounded her, no family mourned at her side. She slipped away, not as the all-powerful emperor, but as an old woman broken by disease, betrayal, and time. Yet even in death, her story was too dangerous. When she was buried beside her husband Gaozong in the Qianling mausoleum, her tombstone was left deliberately blank. No name, no titles, no record of her reign. It was as if the court itself was terrified to define her, too afraid to honor her, too unwilling to condemn her. But history refused to forget. Wu Zetian's legacy remains one of the most unsettling in all of China's past. She was a visionary who promoted scholars, advanced Buddhism, and expanded the empire's power. She was also a ruthless tyrant who executed ministers, destroyed rivals, and even sacrificed her own children. She ruled longer and more absolutely than many emperors, yet her name still carries a chill centuries later. Her final days leave haunting questions. What is the true cost of absolute power? Was Wu Zetian a brilliant reformer who broke barriers for women, or a monstrous despot who drowned her throne in blood? Perhaps she was both, a ruler who defied heaven itself, only to be consumed by the same fear she once inflicted on others. The blank stone at her grave says nothing, but in its silence, it says everything.